History leaves marks that dwindle away over time. People grow old, they die, they forget. History becomes distant. And through that distance, knowledge is lost. Knowledge of tragedies, of mistakes, of inventions, of power, of how civilizations rose and fell. Knowledge of the world before us, a world that, if we're not careful, may come to be again. Ancient cities past our time achieved so much. It's mind-boggling from the perspective of someone who lives in a first-world country. How could any society do so much with so little? And why would they spend lifetimes working to build such great structures that have seemingly no purpose? These are questions we ask, and these are questions that could remain unanswered forever. But luckily, fragments of history remain. Relics of a time long past remain. Relics that allow us to infer so much about the old civilizations, the way they worked, why they worked the way they did, and how they worked the way they did. A simple trinket from the past can tell a whole story that should be preserved forever. Because these trinkets, these artifacts, act as small keys to opening the door back into the old world. Some people believe these old artifacts, relics, trinkets, are all just junk, and it's futile to look into the past. I don't know if it's futile, but I do know, I believe, they belong in a museum. So recently, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle released on Xbox and PC. Well, seeing this game release and the positive reception around it made me realize it's been over 10 years since I've seen the original 3 movies, and I was honestly too young to remember them. So I just rewatched the 3 Indiana Jones movies. Yep, all 3. Thank God Hollywood left that franchise alone and didn't ruin a classic character like Indiana Jones with bad sequels. Yep, thank God. Okay, I do actually have some thoughts on the other movies, but I thought it'd be better to make this video and focus on the glory days, focus on the movies that made Indy a household name. So in reference, that means I'm only talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and The Last Crusade. Starting with 1981's Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark is by far the most iconic of all the Indiana Jones movies. Whether it's the absolutely perfect opening sequence with the boulder, or every scene with Ronald Lacey as Major Arnold Tote, or the chase through the streets of Cairo, and that one scene where Indy shoots the guy with the sword, or the scene where Indy and Marion are trapped in the Tomb of Snakes, the fight on the airplane, and of course, the ending with the Ark. It's a pretty memorable movie, and most notably, I think this movie is the most well-paced adventure of all the films. There is scenes of exposition, but it's always followed quickly by these really cool set pieces that hold up really well today. I think that's one of the best ways to describe the Indiana Jones movies, a bunch of set pieces that fulfill the adventuring archaeologist fantasy. It looks fun and dangerous, constantly dangerous. Seriously, I notice each of these movies have someone who dies in a truly horrific way. In Raiders, you could say it's the guy who gets pushed into the plane propellers, or all the Nazis that melt at the end of the movie when they open the Ark. It's great. So, obviously, the most notable thing about Indiana Jones movies is, of course, Indiana Jones himself, played by Harrison Ford. I don't really know what there is for me to say about Harrison Ford. I guess I'd say if he was a character in the Fallout universe, he'd have his charisma stat maxed out. He really plays the perfect stereotype for an adventurer. Charming, fast-thinking, knowledgeable about history and different societies, able to perform incredible stunts, virtually fearless. I know some say he's afraid of snakes, but that's total BS. He doesn't like snakes. I mean, he's willing to handle them and do what he does at multiple points. Me, I'm genuinely afraid of snakes. If I was in his situation, I'd be petrified, but he still pushes through it all, so... Anyway, rounding up what's good about Indy, he's also good looking. Yeah, good looking. So I'd be stupid not to bring up the musical score composed by the legendary John Williams, a man who has single-handedly defined some of the most classic themes of all time, such as Jaws, Star Wars, E.T., Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Superman from 1978, the first two Home Alone movies, the first three Harry Potter movies, Jurassic Park, and of course the Indiana Jones franchise, and many, many more that would take too long to list. Seriously, I didn't really even realize how much work this guy has really done. I've heard his name, but it's staggering that he composed banger after banger. John Williams is literally the definition of a legend. Also, I've got to mention Marion, played by Karen Allen, since she's the main side character to Indy in this movie. And she's definitely my favorite of the women Indy partners with. She's semi competent and not super annoying like some of the other characters. From the beginning, she feels like the logical character for Indy to end up with if he did choose just one of them. Anyway, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a classic, and its set pieces are timeless. It's honestly difficult for me to levy any criticism at these movies, but I do have some things. The main problem about Raiders isn't really that big of a problem, but I noticed upon rewatch that there isn't really a solid character arc for its characters. I mean, kinda, between Indy and Marion, but they ignore that for the next two movies. So what I mean is the characters don't grow, change, or really learn anything that seems to have an effect on the characters. I mean, they find the arc, and I know that's kind of just left behind by the end. It's too powerful, which makes sense. It's just, there's no impact after all this. And most of the movie kind of just resolves itself. The antagonists kind of just die because of their own stupidity. Indy has nothing to do with the ending of the movie. He's just kind of there. He kind of just happens to survive it because he's a little bit smarter than the rest. Now, all of this isn't actually a complaint. This is the first Indiana Jones movie, and I think it's the perfect introduction to the world of Indy and Indy as a character. Also, this was the first of its kind, so it gets a lot of leeway in that way. That being said, some people will point out how Indy and Marion end up together at the end, which they do, but the relationship is completely ignored for the next two movies, with not even a mention of what happened to Marion until later. So if that's character development, then the writers were doing their best to ruin the character development each film. Anyway, I'm not throwing any shade at Raiders of the Lost Ark, even though it might sound like I am. I'm pointing these things out because it'll become more relevant as I talk about the next two movies and the way that they evolve the plot. This movie is a 10 out of 10 indie film with great comedy, great set pieces, and an amazing leading man. If for whatever reason you haven't seen it, please do yourself a favor and go watch it. If you have watched it, maybe consider giving it a watch or showing it to someone else, this timeless movie. So after Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a fun, well-paced movie, they decided to follow it up with Alright, we get it. You're creepy, okay? Alright, so 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was a very unusual follow-up to Raiders of the Lost Ark, following Indy on a far more condensed, less ambitious story that completely ignores the plot of the prior movie. Maybe because Temple of Doom is set in 1935, which was the year before Raiders of the Lost Ark was set. So if you think about it, Temple of Doom is sort of, in a weird way, like a prequel, which is really weird to think about and something I didn't know until I started researching for this video. Anyway, as a kid, I remember this movie really standing out from the rest of the trilogy. I also remember it feeling a lot darker and more horror-like, which I guess apparently I'm not alone in feeling that way. Overall, I remember multiple scenes scaring me as a little kid, but now they're mostly just a little goofy. I think the scene most people remember from this movie is when Geez. Yeah, earlier I mentioned people dying in horrific ways. This movie may be the most brutal of all of them, at least for me. So this movie's opening is neat. I mean, it's very different as it opens with Indy having a deal go wrong with a crime boss in Shanghai, China. Hijinks ensues and we're quickly introduced to our two other characters. Firstly, we're introduced to Willie, played by Kate Capshaw. Oh boy. So in Raiders, we had Marion, who is somewhat tough and smart. She was able to at least somewhat take care of herself. Well, now we have Willie, who can't take care of herself at all. In fact, for most of the movie, she complains and whines. She kind of insults Indy despite him saving her life. I don't know, she's just a really ungrateful character that's difficult to like. I do get the feeling she's played mostly for laughs, and it is pretty funny how she calms down later in the movie after she finally gets some normal, real food. But overall, she isn't my least favorite character in these indie movies. That title would go to a character in a movie we're not going to talk about right now. Anyway, Willie's annoying but fine, I guess. Kate Capshaw, I think she tried to do her best, and yeah, she ended up marrying Steven Spielberg, so take that as you will. Good for them, I guess. So the other character we've got in this movie, in my opinion, single-handedly saves this movie from being forgettable, and that character is
Wow! Holy smoke! Crash landing!
Short round. Step on it.
Okie dokie, Dr. Jones. Hold on to your potatoes! Crying out loud, there's a kid driving the car!
Short Round is amazing. He was played by Kei Wan, and he was great. And that's not easy for a kid actor, which he was at the time. But I mean, they did something really smart with his character. They gave him passion for Indy. Or, sorry, Dr. Jones. And I think that really helps the fans immediately like Short Round. He's a kid and he loves Indy, Dr. Jones, just like we all do after the first movie. He's also self sufficient and helpful throughout the whole movie. He doesn't complain and whine. He's grateful that he has Indy. Short Round is just a great character, and he really makes this movie memorable. Because without him, I think this movie wouldn't be very well regarded. And in part, it's because of the plot and the setting restriction. Most of Temple of Doom is set in the palace above the temple. Part of it is set in the temple. There is no adventuring out beyond in the movie, besides in the very beginning when they're escaping Shanghai. And on top of that, they reached the palace on accident. They weren't trying to get there. It was all coincidence that they ditched the plane and ended up in tribal land. They pretty much got roped into finding the fancy rock for the village. It's different from the other movies where Indy starts at his college and from his plain average life as a professor, Indy chooses to travel out with his knowledge. Everything in this movie hinges on the point that just happens to happen. Also, interestingly enough, this is the only Indiana Jones movie that doesn't show Indy working as a professor at a college. So, with all that being just said, despite the characters kind of just stumbling to the plot, the movie respects Indy as a character, still having him be the idealistic adventurer that we all want to be or be with. Also, the movie gave us Short Round, as well as a pretty cool ending on the bridge with the frickin' alligators ripping people apart who fall down below. Jeez, this movie's really dark, but despite that, it's fun, unlike a certain indie movie where the fun is overshadowed by the bleak reality that ruins the fantasy. This movie still had fun with the fantasy, and because of that, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is still worth a watch. And because of that, they ended up making another Indiana Jones movie called 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is a perfect cap-off to a complete trilogy, acting as a light origin story for Indy, as well as actually having a real character arc for Indy. I believe this is the most well-written of the movies. Not necessarily my favorite, but definitely for me, just slightly under Raiders of the Lost Ark. Just simply because I prefer the faster pacing of Raiders. That's not to say Last Crusade is slow. There almost always is engaging stuff going on, but it definitely has the most points where it slows down for exposition. At least that's what I felt like, personally. Most notably, this movie gives us Indy's dad, Henry Jones, played brilliantly by Sean Connery. I honestly forgot how much of an old, bumbling, passionate character he played. He loves history and the historical value of artifacts and such. It makes sense how Indy became the way he did, and I really loved watching Indy and his dad interact. I feel like Harrison Ford and Sean Connery definitely had some chemistry going on. Anyway, this movie also gave us another love interest for Indy in Elsa Schneider, played by Alison Doody, who
Is that what you think of me? I believe in the Grail, not the swastika.
You stood up to be countered with the enemy of everything that the Grail stands for. Who gives a damn what you think?
You do!
All I have to do is squeeze.
never mind, she's a Nazi, which is a plot point I actually really like. It's a good twist, and I really like Indy's stance when he learns about this. Like, he's not very forgiving or accepting at all, which, I mean, he shouldn't be. She's a Nazi, and he's not okay with that. Also, in the beginning of the movie, we get to see a young Indy who was played by River Phoenix. He did a good job for the little time he had. So the plot with the Holy Grail stands out far better than the hot rocks from Temple of Doom. Also, this movie feels like an actual adventure where they actually travel, and we get some fun scenes at the end when they find where the Grail is located and Indy has to pass the trials. This movie also has more horrifying deaths, including someone getting crushed under a tank and someone getting beheaded. Definitely more simple and tame than Temple of Doom, but still very brutal. So there's a character I didn't get to mention earlier when I was talking about Raiders, that character being Sala, played by John Rhys Davies, who is basically a friend of Indy in these movies. He's a sort of fun little character that pops up and is real boisterous. A lot of people seem to like Sala, but I'll admit I didn't. Not for any particular reason. He's nowhere near as bad as some of the characters in Dial of Destiny, but he's fine. Anyway, my favorite part of The Last Crusade is the struggle between Indy and his father. Indy is frustrated, feeling like his father was always too obsessed with his work to ever spend time with his son. Indy felt neglected and like his dad cared more about old relics and stuff. Obviously, that isn't true, and at the end of the movie, he proves it, telling Indy to just let go of the Grail. Seriously, in that last scene, so much is conveyed through Sean Connery's expression. You can tell it's not even a struggle to choose. The Grail doesn't matter at all when Indy's life is on the line. It's simple and predictable, but it works as a plot point, and it makes it feel like something really happens between them by the end of the movie. Like the relationship is really starting to get better. And then, of course, the movie ends with the characters riding off into the sunset. It's a perfect ending to a perfect trilogy. If you haven't seen The Last Crusade, go watch it. I really don't have too much more to say besides it's just a really good ending, and it actually has a character arc, so it's cool. So it's easy enough to say the Indiana Jones trilogy holds up pretty well. I mean, the set pieces look great, the acting and comedy is campy in the best way, and though the character arcs are thin, I think rewatching these movies had made me realize they didn't need to be deep, complex stories exploring character motivations and internal conflicts because these movies were just trying to entertain with little to no message trying to sway our political views, unless you're digging for it or you're a Nazi. But otherwise, these movies play out as a fun adventure based around finding artifacts slash relics with religious slash cultural inspirations to tell a story that feels grounded here on Earth, but also fantastical in the sense of reality's limitations. And that's why these movies will forever be timeless classics. They inspire a fantasy of adventure, but they do this by bringing you with them on the adventure. So you feel immersed, and it ends up tapping into that human side of us all that wants to explore, find cool things, see cool places, be the guy with the hat and the whip who goes out to dangerous, forgotten places and bravely pushes forward for a purpose greater than anyone else. So yep, that's the end of my video. Thanks so much for watching, especially if you've made it to the end. I worked really hard to get this out. If you happen to have enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like. It really helps. Also, maybe consider subscribing. That would be extra cool. And yeah, so this channel has been growing gradually, and I'm really happy to see it hasn't stopped. I don't really have that many expectations while being here on YouTube, but I'm just trying to have a little bit of fun with it. It's been a lot of fun putting this video together, so I don't really know what video I'm going to do next, but until next time, see you on the next one.